Teams. I wonder whether everyone was on yet. Hung, are you there? You can hear me and you can see me.
I'm tempted to stay silent, Olive, just to panic you. But yes, I can hear and see you.
Perfect. I can see that we've got 123 and climbing attendees, so I think we can get us started now. I I'm thrilled to welcome everyone here today into the next section of our TestGorilla event. Today we are going to be talking, me and Hung, about sourcing, and we're going to be moving on to the hiring signals and hiring intent that Wouter and Isabel just spoke about in the previous session. And we're going to be kind of moving a little bit further along in that kind of hiring journey and really talking about sourcing with a specific focus on the sourcing stack. I'm Olive. I'm head of people and culture at TestGorilla, and today I'm going to be talking to Hung. Now, Hung Lee, you don't really need any introduction, I don't think, but I'm going to do it anyway because there might be some people who haven't kind of crossed you before, and so you are the sort of the curator of recruiting Brainfood, right? So it's one of I think really one of the industry's most well recognized and popular newsletters and communities around all things recruitment. You have been variously in your career so far a recruiter, an entrepreneur, an advisor, and all things hiring. And I think, well, and I'm sure many of other people on the line today will think of you as a real kind of expert and a thought leader when it comes to that intersection of technology and people and humanity. So I'm so pleased to speak with you today. And I think we're going to have a lot of fun on this topic.
Yeah, really pleased to be here, Olive. So thank you so much for your kind introduction. And hello, everyone. Great to be with you here and sharing this conversation. Please do interact with us in the chat. Love to see what you're saying and what your thoughts are. If you want to give us all a heckle as well, no problem with that as also. Throw some eggs, digital eggs at us if we're saying stuff that you don't like.
Exactly. Yeah, we'll pick them up. We'll deal with those eggs, create a bit of an omelette. Right. So we know we're all here today, right? Because we know that the shift towards AI augmented work isn't just this sort of like far off high level strategy anymore. That was quite a few years ago now. It really is changing the way that we're working. It's changing the daily reality of how we're doing work, how we're interacting with each other. And of course, how we are finding and connecting with talent, of course. Now, as the talent we need evolves, and Wouter and Isabel spoke a little bit about shaping that, how what AI fluency looks like in the workplace and how the kind of the profile of people that we're looking for in our workplaces is changing. So too do the tools that we're using to find them need to evolve. And there's this sort of growing sense out there that the tools that we're using are really keeping pace with our kind of candidate needs. So in this section, we're just going to go a little bit deeper into that and explore what's going on and what you, Hung, thinks is going well in the market, what's not, and what you kind of predict is going to change. But before we start, let's kind of take a pulse check of who's in the room right now. And we're going to put a little poll up online. The magic team on the back is going to help with that. Now, we want to know, people in the room, do you find the tools that your organization uses for sourcing candidates to be effective? Yes, somewhat, or not really. So please pop your answers in. Now, a little bit of a context here to why we're asking this question is that we ran a survey last year where a lot of sourcing teams, so TAs or other kind of operational people within the companies we spoke to, told us that their sourcing tools are actually somewhat or not at all effective at the moment. So let's see how this is going. And yeah, we've seen that actually the smallest bucket here is people saying that the tools that they're using are actually highly effective and consistently deliver the quality of candidates that they need. This matches with this data that we collected in our survey last year, where about 46% of sourcing teams said that their tools were inadequate. And now we're seeing a similar response here. So they're quite stark numbers. We've got something clearly needs to change. So let's dig into them. Let's explore those. What do you think is happening here? Why do you think that so many people are feeling like their sourcing tools are failing to deliver? Does this mean that the previous playbooks and tools that we've been using are obsolete now, or is there something else going on?
I think everything's going on, isn't it, Olive? It's one of those where, having giving sort of a simple response is my habit, but I find it difficult to do when you talk about AI because
Right.
inevitably we're looking at a kind of a shape that really we've never seen before, and there's so many facets to it. So you can say one thing on one facet, which is true, but it actually would be contradicted very easily simply by shifting that shape around and taking a different perspective.
Yeah.
So one explanation as to why people are dissatisfied about the effectiveness of sourcing tools, let's say for hiring AI fluent talent,
Mm,
we can say that the terminology that people are using right now hasn't really caught up to describe what AI fluency really means.
mm,
There was actually that comment made, I think, in Wouter's session just now, where is it sufficient for people to describe themselves as AI literate? Like, what does even that
yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
Does it mean that you've fired up ChatGPT once every day? Does that
Mm,
mean that you're AI fluent? Or do we need to be someone who is like already at the stage where you're orchestrating a fleet of agents doing half of your work right now? So we lack the terminology. The terminology usually takes about 6 to 12 months before, sort of after the demand. So in other words, where we get to the point where companies become and have developed the language to describe the skills that they're looking for. There was actually a recent paper on this. I forget precisely which one it is, but I'll dig it out after this and share it with people. But it was a study exactly on this topic about the how sort of the terminology in job descriptions had this lag factor beyond the demand.
mm,
And you could look at sort of AI first type companies that were a little bit more advanced in adopting artificial intelligence. And the
yeah.
way they described the sorts of skills they're looking for was noticeably different from the companies that were kind of either in the middle or laggard. And the laggards tend to use the term AI literate, AI fluent as a
Mm,
generic bucket to say,
yeah.
look, we need someone to help us get there.
Yeah. But
But
we don't know what that looks like ourselves, and we hope that that person's going to tell us what it is that we should be looking for.
correct. And
Yeah.
if you interact with people that are, if you like, frontier edge power users that are in this radical experimentation phase, they will start using terminology that takes you into the deep waters. I'm part of a group, actually set up a group precisely to test myself on this.
Yeah.
And I selected a dozen people, dirty dozen, who I thought, you know what, these people are probably as advanced as we have within the people ops community in terms of using artificial intelligence. And I can barely follow the thread because they're using terminology that I don't quite understand.
Mm,
And so they are ahead, so to say, but they're obviously a very thin edge of a vanguard. And the vast majority of us are just kind of being pulled along in their wake. So
mm,
I think part of the reason why sourcing tools are struggling to deliver the value is two levels. Number one, the terminology hasn't seeped into the wider marketplace right now,
yeah.
so we're not quite sure what to look for.
Yeah.
And secondly, a little bit might be on the searchers themselves. Like, do we know what we're looking for? We cannot be surprised that the results aren't coming if we can't articulate precisely the skills and the level of proficiency in those skills that we're after. So yeah, that's one interpretation, I guess, as to why these things aren't working.
Yeah, really tricky. I think, and you could have the market using a certain kind of terminology, a company using a different terminology, and how are you gonna match up if we're just sourcing based on sort of keywords and sort of search terms?
There's a deeper philosophical point on that, Olive. Excuse me, with the F1 seems to be going past the door there. But yeah, a deeper issue is, of course, using text. Because we are all using text. AI is using text. But as we're discovering, the same words might mean different things based on context, which is why everyone's talking about, look, this thing hasn't got the context. What is
Mm,
context? Context is basically the meaning behind the words. Because you can say software engineer in one context is actually a different thing to another company in a different context because the time distribution of a task might be massively different.
yeah,
So even that is the case even within an organization and even
yeah.
within teams.
Mm,
And so words may not capture this particularly well, which is why, I think new entrants into the sourcing world that try and like assess for different things might actually be a huge benefit because we can't really tell by the words alone. We're lacking the context.
yeah. Yeah, indeed. Indeed. I think, the word that comes to mind right now is engineer, right? Everyone's looking for engineer, engineer. Whereas, you know, previously you might not have had so many engineers in a go-to-market team or a people team or whatever. We're starting to see this engineer word pop up a little bit more, and what does that actually mean within the context of a given organization? But I think you're already kind of leading us on a little bit to where I wanted to go next, and sort of um, with when we're talking about then the tooling that we're using to try and source candidates, identify candidates, if it's not really going to be on just pure words or text alone, how are you seeing AI sort of coming through and helping us out here in identifying our candidates, both now already, and how do you think it's going to evolve?
Yeah, I mean, sourcing agents do help. I mean, we're getting to the point where the value, the primary value of sourcing agents is basically to give an unskilled user the possibility of actually identifying candidates with natural language search. So I think they're well on their way to providing the capability of doing this. And I think that I wouldn't say this doesn't solve the problem per se, but it will kind of solve the first problem of how I got the long list of individuals that I think might be relevant for the task. The second issue is then how do you validate that information? Because at the end of the day, they're still looking at a piece of text or an aggregation of a load of text and then assuming that that means capability.
Mm,
And of course, you can't get there without assessing the capability in some way. And so there's some very interesting sort of ways in which you can do that. How do you assess who is doing the assessment? It's a very different story. If, for instance, you have a tech to tech type of situation where a tech hiring manager is hiring a tech person, an interview might actually work perfectly fine in that context to be able to assess
mm,
for capability. But if you have, let's say, a HR person or a recruiter that's out of domain trying to recruit someone who with a deep technical specialism, then obviously you're going to need different types of support to find a way to do that sort of assessment on capability.
yeah.
So a lot depends again on the context, like who is doing the assessment, how you're doing the assessment, what is the history? Is it the first time this individual has encountered that organization? It's a different story if that there's a previous relationship in some way.
Mm.
So yeah, there's lots of different reasons or factors that we need to put into play about how today's technology can help us get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it would be remiss of us to think, as with any of these conversations, that you can just sort of, you know, plug in some AI in a basic fashion or throw an agent at it and it's going to do your job entirely. That will never be the full solution there. But combining different tools, using skills-based testing and assessment, for example, to really qualify maybe more kind of text-based sourcing approaches, could can start to paint a little bit more of a holistic sourcing and kind of candidate identification approach.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, there's one of the revealed sort of promises, if you like, of assessments in general is that it can open up the top of the funnel significantly, and you can end up inviting a lot more people to participate in your recruiting experience that you may have casually dismissed, based mainly on your concern about managing sort of the volume.
Yeah.
And everyone, probably the best analogy is this, is the use of academic criteria to screen people out.
Mm,
Where you need to have first class honors degree from these universities, otherwise no go. And we know that doesn't necessarily translate into on-the-job performance. But we used it, I think, primarily to say we've got to manage the volume somehow.
mm,
So the way I'm going to do it is kind of create some artificial conditions
mm,
such that we can cut 1,000 applications to 100, and we're just going to deal with the 100. And probably within that 100, you'll find the people you need, so you don't suffer the penalty for making quite an arbitrary decision at the very beginning. But it's obviously unjust. So wouldn't it be better if you were able to accurately assess 1,000 people, and then you could pick the best from that? So
very
yeah,
best. Yeah, indeed. So you're sort of using more kind of agentic, but still precise hiring sourcing tools to really widen that top of funnel, removing that bias and allowing you to kind of pinpoint who you're looking for. That's what we're aiming to get.
it would be very educational. Let's say you decide to drop all credentialism from your process and you said, look, here's the one gate you've got to go through. These are the assessments everyone goes through, just go through them. And you just, did it in a blind way. And only after the fact did you then kind of reconnect people's biographies to the outcomes. I think that'd be quite interesting.
Mm,
It'd be quite interesting to observe, would you have made the same decision had you had that access to biographical information in the first place?
mm,
Probably not, is my guess, but that experiment anybody can run today. So,
yeah, yeah. We challenge people on the line to look into that in their organizations, perhaps. So, say that we're moving to a world where um, with AI assistance or other sort of AI augmenting workflows, we can delegate a lot of kind of the more typical traditional steps in the hiring, the sourcing process. Let's say so. We have AI assistants for maybe doing kind of market research. We set up some agents for kind of scoping, sourcing, identifying initial outreach. We're doing skills matching to identify those best fit candidates, at least at the early stages in the hiring process. What is then the most impactful way for someone who has traditionally sourced candidates themselves to now be doing with their time?
yeah, I mean, this is probably the source of the greatest anxiety, as well as optimism, for the recruiter community. It does turn out that, a large percentage of the work that recruiters traditionally did, at least during the online era, is imminently automatable. This is the transcribing interview notes. This is translating a requirement sort of captured into a strategy. This is building a sourcing plan. This is actually, retrieving information from a database that could be candidates that you're going to pipeline to even outreaching and all that type of stuff. Turns out, oh, AI can do all of this and do it maybe better than you. So, what is the job going forward? The job, I think, is going to dramatically evolve. I mean, when you have a job where 70, 80% of the work or the time you spent in the work can now be automatable, very clearly there's a transformation in place here. We have to embrace it. And the optimists amongst us have sort of done that. And they can see that the future looks a lot more about stepping above all of the processes that we previously ran and being the orchestrator and designer and trainer of these processes, and making sure all of these things go according to the standards that you, as the talent acquisition person, have set for your business. So, well, one of the ways to think about this is that AI is not quite end to end at this point. We thought at one point it would be end to end, meaning, you know what, it's going to just initiate process, go
Yeah,
all the way through the multi steps, and then execute the output and produce an output, and there you go. It's
yeah,
not, it's really middle to middle. So, in other words, on either end of that workflow is a human being. A human
mhm,
being has to kind of set and initiate and confirm that this is the plan.
yeah,
And then they really need to step above that workflow and monitor the progress as they go forward.
mm,
And then at the end, at the output, that's when they have to sense check the output and make sure that this is happening according to plan or
mm,
according to, intuition. And we shouldn't throw away sort of the lived experience and the accumulated knowledge that we have working in the domain and within your organization. I mean, this might lead us into some difficult ideological positions, but it may well be that we need to revisit some of our sort of our priors and rethink what it looks like in a world where do we really value human judgment and what are the implications of that?
mm.
What does it mean, for instance, that human is in the loop? Do we really know what that means and what the implications of it? And are we committed to those implications? So those things I think we've probably yet to have a conversation on, but happy to engage on it here and later on if you want.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic. I mean, human in the loop, right? I mean, for those of us outside of a very technical background, it's um it's a term that's I think we're all familiar with now, but it feels fairly recent, right? And again, it's one of these. So we're going back to the beginning of a conversation, terminology, understanding context, shared and common understanding of what things mean. It's probably another example where we're yet to really align and flesh out what that means, and it will evolve over time as well. I think, yeah, fascinating. I think one thing that I think is really exciting is that for now, at least, we're still in the business in the people world of hiring people, right? So with the if TA folk are thinking of what is my purpose, what do I bring, what is my value within this process, well, we're people hiring people still, and it's working out that intersection between people and technology, but ultimately there is still a huge amount for the people side of things to happen as we're bringing people into an organization, into a team. Keeping an eye on time, so I don't want to run out and push the agenda out of sync today. Um, as we head further into 2026, what is one sourcing sin, one absolute mistake that you think talent leaders should stop committing, either if it comes into their sourcing stack or more generally, what should we stop doing?
There's sourcing is one of those it's one of those challenges where it often gets blamed for a failed sort of recruitment process. You know,
Yeah.
you're either not sourcing effectively, you've got recruiters that are not competent to find the people.
You're not doing
Um, uh,
enough, you're not doing it in the right place.
Exactly, exactly. There is no magic tool. There is no magic bullet. There has to be kind of a really strong alignment internally before you're able to emerge with an effective sourcing plan. And what I mean by this is that the people who are making decisions all the way down that pipeline need to be aligned on how to make that decision. Like, what is it? Where are we going to commit our time? Where are we going to commit our budget? What do we expect to achieve with that commitment? And how do we measure the success of it? All of those things typically, some component of this is missing in the process, which is why we end up sort of having a lot of pressure squeezed typically towards the execution level and saying, look, you're not working hard enough. Recruiters work very hard. I seriously, I've yet to see someone who is not working hard enough in recruiting. I think it's one of those functions where you can't really take slack. Avoid this. Make sure there's alignment internally before you do anything with tooling or with any other strategy. You've got to get everyone on the same page.
Absolutely. And I think this is such a clear example with the if we go back to AI, if we think about sourcing agents, for example, garbage in, garbage out, if you're not crystal clear on what you're looking for and have that alignment, then doing anything at a higher volume or a more kind of human hands-off way is just going to exacerbate the frustration, the disappointment, the potential irritation that a source pipeline might not be delivering. It's because there hasn't been the alignment first. So yeah. Um, and to flip that on a slightly more positive side, so we've got rid of the misalignment, we've got rid of that big sourcing sin. On a more sort of positive upside, what is that? There's sort of one real sort of takeaway if someone's going to walk away with one thing, if they're looking to kind of implement really kind of future-proof sort of sourcing this year to build the team that they need. What would you recommend?
I'm going to give two recommendations, which I've now turned into a bit of an evangelist on.
Do
So
it.
I'm not an objective observer. I'm a proselytizer on these 2 points. Okay. So number one, I think you need to have a dedicated recruitment operations function within TA, meaning that we've had 2 to 3 years of working with artificial intelligence, and it's very clear to me that where companies are able to accelerate, the ones that have done it have a dedicated resource that's looking at process improvement, process automation, and implementation of technologies. We have to remember that TA generally has been kind of like reduced in headcount a couple of times already in the last sort of 5 years. So we're walking into a higher demand sort of environment with less people. And so everyone is maxed out. Everyone is already at 100%. It's very difficult to do a process shift when everyone has no bandwidth whatsoever. So the reason, for instance, why TA and HR generally might feel, oh, we're a little bit behind the curve is because we have no bandwidth to do a process switch. So that bandwidth isn't going to magically appear. You need to basically get someone dedicated to do it, meaning this person cannot sort of hold headcount. They've got to go and focus purely on optimization. The second thing I would say as a strong thing I believe in is we've got to implement what I call a keep what you kill policy. Um,
Yeah.
Keep what you kill.
Okay.
So it's not my term. It's a term by a guy called Aaron Levy, who's the CEO of Box, one of these AI sort of first Maxa type people. And he basically said, look, in order to get the entire organization to implement AI in an accelerated way, you have to align the incentives.
Mm,
People might subliminally be aware that if you're just optimizing away, that they may be eating into the jobs that keep them in the business.
yeah.
And so they may be slow walking this, in which case you have to kind of provide immediate return to the people who are doing the optimization. So the
Mm,
policy is keep what you kill. Any team member that is able to improve a process, that time doesn't just disappear into the ether. That time is returned to the operator that done it, so that they
mm,
can reinvest it in the stuff that they want to do, i.e., the higher value work, quote unquote, that we want to try and do. So, in other words, the gains in the productivity that we have with the using of AI need to be recycled back into increasing the scope of the TA and people function and doing the higher value work that we say we care about.
nice. Reinvesting the dividends. Awesome. That was a whistle stop tour. I feel like we could carry on talking about this for ages, Hung, and maybe we will on a different setting. And I also appreciate that people have put questions in the chat, which we're not going to have time to answer, I'm afraid. But I have no doubt that our marketing will be following up on ways that you can learn more from each of our panelists and get in touch with them and follow them around the web. Should you want to find out a little bit more, get answers to your questions in a different way. Hung, thank you so much for spending time with me today and with us at TestGorilla and our whole audience. For the rest of the people who are online, what I recommend doing right now is moving back into the Zoom lobby, and we're going to have a little bit of a closer look at the TestGorilla platform. We've got one of our product leaders, Simon, who's going to be walking us through. Simon's been with us for a while now. He knows our platform inside out, and I think it's going to be a really great chat. Yeah, once again, Han, thank you so much for your time. It's been great.
Thank you, Olive, and thank you everyone for listening.
Bye bye.